Josh, Steve Weiner from the Associated Press. Following up on John's question earlier, is it safe to say the Commander's name is around just to stay? Is that safe to say from your standpoint?
Yes.
The fact that the Commanders, again, have an owner who feels like it is his responsibility to answer questions from the press at the end of a season. This is how sports are supposed to work, everybody. I know it's weird because we're so used to the fact that Dan Snyder was a recluse and didn't hold a press conference for the better part of a decade. And even when he did pop his stupid little head up, he didn't answer any questions about anything, from the coach he just hired to the executives he hired or fired or the brand. Like, he didn't answer questions about anything forever because he was terrible. But Josh Harris, he's here. And he understands that accountability, and who knows, maybe he'll do like a fan Q&A at some point, but at the very least, like, holding a year-end press conference is pretty standard operating procedure for most sports team owners. And good for Josh Harris for doing it here a week after the season. Now, the number one question on everyone's mind for ownership was the branding and the team name. Obviously, there's a lot of questions about the stadium situation, but as it has come back up again in recent days, and my pal Don Van Natta even said on our show, like, he's heard that perhaps the team is really considering it, but there are other considerations as the team finds success that perhaps maybe they're less open to it now than originally thought. Josh Harris definitively came out today and said the Commander's name is here to stay. He was asked about it first question, and he was like, this name starts to mean something in the building. And then he was asked later by Stephen Wino directly, like, is it safe to say the Commanders is here to stay? And he said, yes. And good for Josh Harris for shutting this down. Not necessarily to say, like, I would say this, right? When I say good for shutting it down, thank God we have an answer. Because if he had also come out today and said, yes, we are going to eventually embark on a rebrand, then that would also be an acceptable answer to me. What I appreciate what Josh Harris did today is shutting down the limbo. The will they or won't they is over. And the fact that it happens to be over, I think is actually a really good thing as well, because now we all can collectively move on. It's over. It's done. We can move on to everything else that matters a million times more than a name, which is the football and how they build this team from an NFC championship game participant to a legitimate Super Bowl contender, as if they weren't already. If you're in the NFC championship game, you're a legit Super Bowl contender. But a perennial Super Bowl contender at the level that they want to be, where they go up to a matchup or into a matchup with a team like the Eagles, and they are not a, hey, maybe if everything goes right type of underdog. They're a team that Philly looks at and goes, oh God, that's our equal. But when it comes to the name itself, I'd like to talk about it, I don't know, one final time. Brand names don't become brand names by merely existing. They become brand names by establishing themselves as successful. And that goes for sports teams that get associated with excellence, or things like Q-Tip or Kleenex that are so clearly the best in their field that they become synonymous with the very thing itself. Now, before we go any further, I want to do two things. One, for those that have not heard me talk about this topic before, I choose when talking about it not to use the old nickname at all. I'm also not someone who is going to shout you down when we open up the phone lines if you do. That is not, I might poke fun with a little Doug Williams action because it's funny.
We are the Commanders.
And we might even go the full Craig Melvin. But I'm not going to shout you down and be like, how dare you? But I choose not to use it because there is a disagreement in Native American and Indian circles about whether or not that word is a slur. And while there are plenty of indigenous folks who aren't offended by it and some who even see it as a term of honor or endearment, I choose not to say it because of the folks who do see it as a slur, and I don't see it in my place to cross them. I also know that most fans who still say the old nickname are referencing a football team and not trying to be offensive, and I think that matters. I think the intention matters. So that's my reasoning. That's where I stand. That is my choice. You are more than free on this show and in your life to make yours, and now that we've established that ground rule, we can move on from that part of it. I also want to acknowledge that there are three groups of people who passionately wanted to see the name changed. First, there are those who are acting in good faith that don't want to see the name go back to the old one at all, but hate Dan Snyder and or the name Commanders because it's pretty objectively lame, and they want to see the team move forward from the Commanders, one more name change, one final time, and then we are done. The second group, I think, is also acting in good faith, and those are folks who want to see the name go back because that's the era that they remember with the most fondness. It's those of you who are most likely to say, I want my team back, and I totally get that as well. And then there's a third group who isn't acting in good faith at all and sees this as a culture war. They like saying the old nickname because they think that they're doing something politically. And I don't understand that one at all. To me, y'all have lost the plot about what sports are about, winning, cheering on your team, being a part of a community that can come together despite any other differences you may have politically or otherwise to do something that is fun as a city and cheer on the guys on the field or the gals on the field or court. You've also lost the plot on probably some other things in life, and I don't have time for that right now. So I know that I'm not going to convince the third group of people of much of anything. So I'd like to talk to the first two groups or anyone that maybe is on the fence of the second and third group, someone who is maybe questioning how they feel about going back and what those motivations truly are. After the season that Washington just had, where perhaps the rage of feeling like the world took away your team ran into the joy of seeing them actually be good and playing well again, and you're trying to make sense of that. So the first person that you can thank or blame for what Josh Harris did today, to me, is actually Adam Peters. Because it was Peters who led the entire free agency and draft process last year, saying that they were, quote unquote, looking for Commanders. They had the Commanders tag in the draft and all of that. So when Josh Harris says this.
Yeah, so just to hit the name first, like we're focused on, we're back to saying, you know, what we said all last year, which was focused on winning football games, on getting prepared for next year, on fixing up Ashburn and the stadium. We could talk about that. And then on engaging with the community of Washington. And so right now, and now in this building, the name Commanders means something. It means that, you know, it's about players who, you know, are love football, are great at football, hit hard, mentally tough, great teammates. And so it's really meaningful that that name is growing in meaning. And so, but as far as rebranding and bringing our past, you know, which obviously I grew up with, and all the Super Bowl championships and our future together, you're going to see us head back towards, you know, honoring our past and bringing it together with
our future, how that quote ends up. And he talks about how it means something to people in the building. Adam Peters is at the head of that. If that makes you hate Adam Peters or even dislike him a little more, I really want you to sit with that. Think about it. What is it exactly that you want out of your sports? Because if it's not winning, that is inherently, by definition, loser behavior. And that's not an endorsement of having no brand image or identity. It's not saying change it every year as long as they win. That's annoying, and it does take away from the experience of building something that you can feel proud of. But if Commanders become synonymous with excellence, isn't that kind of the point? And for a lot of folks in that second group that I talked about, that's really what this was about. The old moniker was about excellence, even though for 30 years it was mostly synonymous with embarrassment and whatever the most polar opposite of excellence is, which also meant that means for anyone under the age of 35, there was literally zero excellence to remember. This team was as embarrassing as you could possibly be, named that old name for the entire time. But then there's also the historical argument that some people make, and I'd like to address that because I think I can pretty quickly shut down that thing once and for all. The argument that you must go back because we cannot possibly have a team named by Dan Snyder because Dan Snyder is awful and did awful things, and it cannot possibly stand, holds zero water if you know anything about the team's previous permanent name. The team was called the Braves when it was founded for the incredibly highbrow reason that they shared a stadium with the baseball Boston Braves, a.k.a. the original team owner, George Preston Marshall, was lazy, didn't think of anything original at all. He was so lazy, in fact, that when they moved stadiums across town in Boston, that they were now playing at Fenway Park, the home of the Red Sox, they changed the name to the old one, but wanted to keep their logos. No effort to redesign. Just let's literally change the name, and I'm too lazy to do anything else. Influencing that decision at the time of keeping the native heritage or native logos was the team's coach, William Dietz, who liked to be called Lone Star Dietz because he proclaimed that he was of Indian descent. He claimed that his mother was of the Sioux tribe, except most historians think he was completely full of crap. He was German, but liked the attention of proclaiming he was native. His story changed all the time to be convenient. He was notably great at PR for himself and himself only, and most historians have debunked his native origins and said he was a con man. And if you need a reminder, by the way, of who George Preston Marshall was, oh, buddy, I got some news for you. He was the avowed racist who resegregated the NFL in the 1930s and made sure that Washington was the last team to resegregate in the 1960s. Desegregate in the 1960s. Only doing so, only allowing black folks onto his team because the D.C. city government was going to ban the team from playing at D.C. Stadium if they didn't. So, in response to wanting to avoid all the things that Dan Snyder did, all of the terrible things, anyone who wants to go back to the name created by the most racist owner in the history of the NFL, so racist, in fact, that the team went from powerhouse in the late 30s, winning NFL championships, to being one of the worst franchises in the league because they simply refused to let some of the best players in the sport on their team because they were black. That was the guy who owned it. And if you want to go back to the name created by that guy and the con man, I think that your argument doesn't hold a whole lot of water. So, forget whether the team name is a slur or racist or offensive or any of that. If we're into getting rid of nicknames because of terrible owners, that one should have been gone a long time ago. So if you want to move forward, I get it. Today's a bit of a bummer. And I'm all for moving forward off of Commanders because of Snyder and saying that was his last imprint. Let us move on. And I genuinely feel for anyone who feels passionately about that. If you didn't know any of the history that I just told you and you need a moment, I get that too. But ultimately, the same reason the old nickname overcame that history with Senor Doofus Dietz and George Preston Marshall is because the team won. That Joe Gibbs came along and with Joe Theismann, Doug Williams, and Mark Rippon won Super Bowls and created a bond with the city and a bond with the fans that has lasted 30 years later through all of the BS of the Snyder era. There is that deep, rich, emotional connection. And that was enough to overcome what was the history of the origins of the old team name. So because of those reasons, I love that Harris and the team plan on honoring those players and that past and the rich history of the franchise that exists here in D.C. But as we firmly enter the next phase of Washington football history, it was time to close that open door.
Josh, Steve Weiner from the Associated Press. Following up on John's question earlier, is it safe to say the Commander's name is around just to stay? Is that safe to say from your standpoint?
Yes. And we're actually, I think it's now being embraced by our team, by our culture, by our coaching staff. And so, we're going with that.
And so today, he did.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's the Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.